how have anthropologists, both now and also in the past, theorized about different types of societies? What leads to all this cultural variation? And one of the main ways in anthropology's origins, sort of late 1800s, turn of the 19th century, or 20th century, excuse me, was biological markers. Physical anthropologists were looking at physical traits. Namely, one of the main traits they were looking at was what they called race, mainly looking at skin color, to try to categorize human groups. If people are traveling around at this time, you have colonialism, missionization, trade, basically white Europeans coming into contact with other groups of people that not only look very different from them, but also behave very different, have much different customs and culture. And so one of the early ways that anthropologists theorized what leads to the differences is this concept of biological race, that the physical differences could explain the differences in behavior that we see. And so you watched this film since we last met, Race, the Power of an Illusion. We watched the first part, the differences between us. And so we're going to talk about race today. There's a lot of different ways we could talk about race. And today we're going to be talking about it from an anthropological perspective. So namely, looking at it as a way to describe, or rather not describe, human variation. So I left you with these maps last time. They're maps of global skin color gradations. And if you look at the map on the right, that's a global map of UV radiation, the red being more intense, blue being less intense sunlight. And what you're seeing is race is not actually a biological construct. It's a social categorization. It's people looking at a couple of traits, maybe 4 to 5 physical traits, eye shape, hair form, largely skin color, and then subjectively drawing boundaries around that. That's why some people come up with 5 races. Some people come up with 55. That's why every year when you, not every year, but whenever you fill in those different forms with the census and how do you identify, those categories change every time the form changes. If it was biological, if it was objective, you would expect that we could come up with a set number of categories, but we can't. It changes because it's not actually biological. And so skin color is an environmental adaptation to the particular environments people used to inhabit. Namely, it's a trade-off between blocking out harmful UV radiation and also allowing enough UVB radiation in to synthesize vitamin D. Your body requires UVB radiation to synthesize vitamin D. It happens in the layers of your skin. And so in equatorial regions where sunlight is most intense, and UV radiation can be very damaging. It can damage your DNA, cause cancer. High levels of melanin, which creates that dark color, that pigmentation in the skin, were selected for. They were advantageous in these regions because they help block out high levels of UV radiation, and you're still absorbing enough sunlight to synthesize vitamin D. As groups moved north and southward in latitude, where sunlight becomes less intense, UV is not as intense, less and less melanin became selected for, leading to lighter skinned individuals as you move north or south, because high levels of melanin are not as crucial at these northern and southern latitudes where UV is less intense. You don't need as much melanin to block out the harmful effects, but having too much melanin, having high levels of it, can actually block out so much UV that you're not able to synthesize vitamin D. And so you see this trade-off, darker skin, high levels of melanin in UV intense regions, and then lighter skin, less melanin selected for as you move into less UV intense regions. Don't need it, and it can become counterproductive in terms of synthesizing vitamin D. And so that's what we're seeing. That's what skin color is. It's an environmental adaptation. Obviously, in the last few decades, plus, people have been moving around quite a bit with globalization and travel. And so these maps sort of reflect indigenous populations. That's maybe not what it would look like today if we tried to do this. So I left you with these questions to keep in mind while you were watching the film. First, I know I've told you race is not biological or genetic. It's a social categorization. And the film sort of talks about several lines of evidence that I want to draw a few of them out for you. And these other questions as well. right? Even though I'm telling you race is a social categorization, it still has identifiable, tangible effects on people's biology. It's not through the genetics that causes that, but the social inequality, the lived experience, the social marginalization of these different groups identified as different races. Through access to resources, education, nutrition, where you grow up, what opportunities you're exposed to, race, that social categorization of it becomes manifest in biology, in health disparities. We'll talk a little more about that here in a minute. And kind of this last question, which is more of a thinking question. So from the film, one of the things they talk about is that humans, from a genetic standpoint, are actually we're genetically very similar as a species compared to other species. Francis, yeah, go ahead.
In the film, they had mentioned like one particular line in the beginning saying that 1 in every 1,000 nucleotides was probably different between individual humans, and that fruit flies were more genetically varied than us, in the same line that we are genetically different from like primates. So,
Yeah. Oops, sorry. I got so excited, Francis. I didn't mean to cut you off. Yeah, exactly. They talk about this example saying humans. Actually, let me switch to the whiteboard really quick because that's a great point. Let's talk about genetics for just a sec. All right, excuse my drawing, right? So as Francis pointed out, the film talks about between any two humans, about 1 out of every 1,000 nucleotides in our DNA is different. And this is not a lot. If you take any two penguins that look absolutely identical physically, the amount of genetic differences between those two identical penguins is up to 2 times as much genetic difference than between any two humans. And as Francis said, any two fruit flies, even though they're identical, can have up to 10 times as much genetic difference as any two humans. Even though the two humans might look very different and the fruit flies look identical. So that whole saying that our differences really are skin deep it's kind of true, right? Genetically, we're quite similar. And so, like Francis said, 2 fruit flies, up to 10 times more different than any 2 humans. So that 2 fruit flies might be genetically more different, even though they're the same species, than a human and a chimpanzee, right? So as a species, Homo sapiens, genetically, we're all very similar. And so DNA, sorry, I'm going to use my hand to write or try. Deoxyribonucleic acid. You see different diagrams of it, usually rolled up as sort of this double helix. If we unwind the DNA, it's these 2 different strands sort of made up of a sugar phosphate backbone. Those are the 2 lines. And then you have these nucleotide pairings. There's only 4 different types of nucleotides. Adenine, cytosine, thymine, and guanine. And I will not ask you about this, but just so we all know. So those 4 nucleotides, A, C, T, G, those are the ingredients for all of life, whether it's a Homo sapien, a snail, a slime mold, a piece of bacteria, or an elephant. Same exact ingredients, these 4 nucleotides. It is the arrangement, the order, the recipe that determines whether it's a snail or a human or an elephant, right? And so only about 1 out of us, and they pair like this. This is how DNA just works. That's also how it replicates, right? It unzips itself and then base pairs form a new strand by pairing up. Only about 1 out of every 1,000 of these nucleotides differs among humans. And so race, by and large, it's people looking at a handful of traits and then arbitrarily, subjectively determining the categories. The film also talks about a really important point, which is science and scientists don't exist in a vacuum, right? Their ideas aren't informed only by the data that they're working with. Their ideas, the way they think about the world, is influenced by the societies they live in. Right. And we still, and especially at the time, live in a racialized society in which structural racism is built in. And one of the ways in which race science was used early on is if you can say that this group of people is biologically inferior, right, that it's biology that's determined it, then it kind of justifies their position lower on the socioeconomic ladder, right? It justifies that marginalization, that poverty. Well, yeah, they're genetically inferior. I'm not saying that, but that's what folks were saying at the time. And so you don't really have to do anything about it, right? In this view, inequality is sort of natural, right? Kind of this survival of the fittest idea, something that Darwin never said, that was coined by a social theorist named Herbert Spencer, who considered life before Western civilization to be nasty, brutish, and short, which is also not true. And the film gives this example. They say in 1896, I think it was, American race scientists published this piece on Negro evolution, and essentially concluding that they are biologically inferior. This is what they were saying at the time. This same year that they published this study saying that the Negro race is biologically inferior, the Supreme Court upheld Jim Crow segregation, right? So again, it doesn't exist in this vacuum. Ideas are not necessarily objective, even scientific ones. These aren't very scientific ones. And just one more point on that, the film also talks about it was American race science and scientists, their ideas are what informed the eugenics movement in Nazi Germany, right? The Nazis themselves said that they derived their ideas from those of American race scientists at the time. So even though race might not be real biologically, don't be mistaken, it's real in other ways, which we'll talk about. Okay, so from the film, just a few pieces of evidence. If race was biological, based in genetics, then we would expect there to be more genetic variation between any two so-called racial populations rather than within any so-called racial population. But what you find if you look at the genetics is the exact opposite. There's more genetic variation within populations rather than between so-called different racial populations. The students in the film are they're comparing their mitochondrial DNA. And the white male says, I think I'm going to look like the other white males. Other people think they're going to look like people that share their physical traits. And that's not what they find, right? They find that it really doesn't have any bearing on it. 85% of all genetic variation is among any single population, not between two populations. Another piece of evidence, this idea of genetic concordance versus discordance. So the way you can think of these words, concordance meaning sort of agreement, and discordance, it's discordant, it's disagreement, doesn't go together. And there's no concordance of genetic traits that are associated with race, right? If you look at skin color, there should be other identifiable genetic traits that align with different skin colors, right? That group, sort of a suite of racial traits, if you will, but there's not. There's no suite of traits to define these groupings by. Again, it's people looking at skin color, and the number of races changes over time. There's no set number of identifiable races, right? People, even if you're looking at the same data, people come up with different categories because it's not objective. There's no way, there's no criteria by which to actually measure this in biology. And so there's no set number, whether you pick skin color, if you pick eye form, you'll come up with a different number. If you pick hair form, you'll come up with yet a different number. Let's say that we pick just one trait. Let's take skin color. Even if you use just skin color, it still doesn't work. The boundaries still end up being subjective, right? Because you can't draw definitive boundaries around a trait, skin color, that changes gradually according to the environment. There are no distinct boundaries, right? So, no basis in biology, it's a social concept. But how might you argue that it still has impacts on health or biology, if you will? And so just from the slide, it's the social labeling that actually affects people's biology, especially health. Through the social inequality, poverty, lack of access to crucial resources, living in environments that are polluted with lots of toxins. The influence of race becomes manifest in biology. The health disparities, though, that you'll hear people talking on the news, like African Americans have higher rates of hypertension. It's not because of their skin color or they're not genetically predisposed to that. It's from the lived experience, right? There's this great article by a biological anthropologist, Gravely, and they're talking about this and looking at how can we actually measure this scientifically, that the health disparities, like high blood pressure or type 2 diabetes or heart disease, come from the social inequality rather than the biology. And so Gravely did this study in, I believe, Puerto Rico. I didn't reread it recently. And what they looked at is, so they had a sample size, a group of people, 100 people. They measured a couple things. First, they measured actual skin color through like mass spectrometry. They objectively, if you will. So they measured that. And then they also measured what people perceived their skin color to be. So sort of, let's just say some people would see themselves as darker than their actual objective skin color, some people as lighter. And so what they found is the actual skin color measured through the mass spectrometer, not my thing, obviously, didn't have any correlation with health disparities. It had no effect, actual skin color, race, no effect. But the way that people perceived their color, so say they were a certain color, but they saw themselves as darker, that the way they perceived themselves relative to everyone else in the population, that had an influence on health. And the proxy they used for health was blood pressure. So high blood pressure being a proxy for causing other issues in your health, your well-being, your life. So those that they measured that actually had dark skin, but didn't self-identify that way, no health disparities. Those, and especially those of lower down on the socioeconomic ladder, regardless of their actual skin color, those that identified as darker tended to have higher blood pressure, all these other health disparities, right? So it's not the actual genetics, the biology, the skin color, it has nothing to do with it, right? It's that social recognition, the marginalization, the lack of access or equal access to resources, and all that follows from a racialized society. I saw something in the chat. Lori says, race is subjective to people. You can be born one race and die another. This happened to my grandpa. It's not really got bumped down real quick. A doctor that birthed you can assign race to you. And when you die, a coroner can assign race to you. Yeah, that's a great point. You have different people and the coroner has a different idea than someone else. And moreover, if you go to Brazil or the Caribbean or Solomon Islands, what is black here is not black in Solomon Islands or Brazil, right? What we would consider black here might be considered Indio Canela or sort of light skinned somewhere else. So it changes not just according to the person looking at it, but how the culture defines it, how the time period's defining it. It is subjective, if you will. Yeah, Francis, go ahead.
So, couldn't you argue that physical differences in humans are just caused by the human nature of adaptability itself? And that, say, if you go back in time before like human transportation, like airplanes and stuff, you had these isolated groups of people. If you had magically moved them to like a different location, if given enough time, wouldn't they start exhibiting new physical traits on the scale of maybe multiple generations to millennia? And then wouldn't they start adapting physically to their environment and start maybe even changing skin color or like physical like traits, like maybe something? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, and so in theory, yes. Like say we did an experiment starting today, which we won't because we can't do that with humans. But that's actually kind of happened already. As you were talking, it made me really. So originally, Homo sapiens originate out of Africa. The jury is out. As an anthropologist, that's the answer I'm going to give you. There's a few other sort of theories out there. We originate in Africa, and then there's different migrations out. Homo erectus, Homo habilis didn't leave Africa. Neanderthals at some point show up in Europe. Neanderthals, so I'm going sort of outside of human, anatomically modern humans, but Neanderthals, for example, so as archaic human ancestors moved out of Africa, they did start to adapt to the different regions they were inhabiting. And Neanderthals you find in they're cold adapted, essentially. You find them primarily in regions of Europe. Actually, Neanderthal is named after Neander Valley in Germany. Tal is valley in German. So Neander Valley, Neanderthal. Never thal, it's a German word, don't use the TH. Neanderthals. And they have wider nasal breadth. So they have a larger surface area when they breathe air in to help warm that air up. They have thicker cranial morphology and a few other sort of physical traits that reflect adaptation to living in cold environments. Fast forward a bit to sort of modern day, the most recent migration out of Africa. That's exactly what happened. Everyone that left Africa would have taken their genes with them. And then once you start to spread out, become geographically isolated from other populations and thus reproductively isolated from other populations, you can start to diverge genetically. And so this is kind of what we see with skin color, actually. People would have been darker skinned coming out of equatorial Africa, and then less and less melanin, that lighter skin, lighter pigmentation was selected for as people move sort of north, south. So let me know if that does not sort of fit with where you're going with that. But yeah, that's kind of already happened. And it's important to, Francis pointed out, over long periods of time. So this is not something we can test in our lifetimes. When we're talking hundreds of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years up to millions of years, right? Anatomically, modern Homo sapiens evolved roughly 100,000 years ago, probably longer ago. And we're really not that much different from Homo erectus 2 million years ago. So the point being that biological evolution moves at a glacial pace, but yes, in theory, that's technically what we would expect, and indeed what we've actually seen happen. Yes, good. Angel said, in my time in Southeast Asia, the idea of being whiter was a status symbol, so they would put bleach cream on their skin. Even saw some babies with that paste, only know the long-term effects. Yeah, actually, in a former class of mine, a student brought that up, and her parents were from India, and her mom was using a cream, and I think I don't remember exactly, but I think the ingredient, Jesus, was mercury in it. And people actually, there's stories, if you go Google it, there's stories of people getting really hurt, poisoned from these toxins, from putting this cream on their skin to make their skin look lighter, because of the social status markers, the social recognition of race, right? Actually sort of bleaching and putting other toxins on our skin. I mean, think about that for a minute. Thank you for sharing that. Angel, yeah, please.
Just kind of like a little quick kind of anecdote, I guess. Like with this, I always think like if Beethoven didn't have access to a piano, would we know who Beethoven is? It's all about having that structure and that ability to have those objects in your life that actually make somebody successful, not the person themselves. The person is a blank slate. You can do whatever you want. It's about having access to that piano.
Yes, I like that analogy. It's clean too, and I like that. Yeah, we're not sort of born, and we all have different sort of biology to an extent, a little bit. Some of us are tall and not, but so much, like where you end up in life, so much of that has nothing to do with biology, right? It's sort of your social position and what's going on in society at that time that determines it. Yeah, you're not going to be a Beethoven if you can't afford a piano or you don't have access to a piano, etc. Right? You're not going to go on to do this or that if you don't even have enough food to eat while you're in elementary school, right? Which is something we see today in this country. Okay. And then the last sort of question I had or asked you about that you all wrote about, and there's no right or wrong for this. It's just to get us thinking. How might saying the concept of race be more accurate than just saying race when we talk about it? Race, we could say race because, concept of race, because yeah, race is not biological. So sort of address that in language to stop perpetuating the notion of it as biology. But also race is very, very real, right? So, and concept of race maybe doesn't do that justice, right? Because the inequality, right? The health disparities, that is real. So don't be mistaken. Race is real, but not in the way that many people conceptualize it, right? It's not biological. It has no genetic basis. It's a social concept that's generated massive inequality and poverty among minority so-called racial groups. It's the inequality, the poverty, the lack of access to crucial resources that we all as human beings need to survive at sort of culturally acceptable levels. Lack of access to healthcare, education, employment, nutrition, living in toxic environments. It's this among certain groups identified as different races that actually has tangible effects on people's biology and their health. Right? Again, it's not biology or genetics that underlie certain racial health disparities. It's the social inequality. Okay, so race is going to come back up when we talk about identity. But in terms of it being a way to understand human variation, it's essentially a useless concept, right? It doesn't hold up. It's not a biologically valid thing. And so at the same time, early physical anthropologists were sort of theorizing about different types of societies. Cultural anthropologists were coming up with their own ideas to try to explain cultural diversity. This is just an outline of some of the approaches we're going to be touching on. So we won't get through it today. This idea of complex versus simple, this is a main analytical distinction that we make today, a way we talk about different types of societies. It avoids the value-laden pejorative terms like savage versus civilized or primitive versus modern, which are ethnocentric and useless, and we'll talk about that. But this is the way anthropologists did it initially, right? Sort of inferior, superior. This is what unilineal evolution is all about. Early cultural anthropologists had this idea that culture has sort of evolved in this straight line of progress, things getting better and more efficient and superior all along the way. It's a really inaccurate way to understand human variation. And it was corrected by the father of American anthropology, Franz Boas, and his theory, historical particularism. So we won't talk much about the history of anthropology, but it's important to see where we've been so we can avoid going there again. And then we'll get into contemporary approaches, sort of how do we do it today? Why do you have the Kung, right? Hunter-gatherers with general reciprocity, and then other very different types of societies like the Aztecs or us here in the US, right? What leads to those differences?